I'm Matt Kaplan of the Planetary Society, now Senior Communications Advisor, but of course for many years, 20 years, host of Planetary Radio. And very quickly, Marc Hartzman is the other fellow that you see on screen, somebody that I've had several conversations with in the past. I can't reach the big book of Mars now, the first book I talked to him about, because it's too far down. He's got that one handy too.
I figured it might be
good
handy.
work.
Yeah.
But of course, we are here to talk about his new book, We Are Not Alone, and I will give you the full title once again: The Extraordinary History of UFOs and Aliens Invading Our Hopes, Fears, and Fantasies. And that dedication to the people of Earth and whoever else. So, Marc, welcome again.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You start right out in this book, and we're hoping that everybody who's joining us now has read the book or is maybe in the middle of it. If you haven't, you can find it from Quirk Books and all the usual places online. You start right out with a visit that you made to Roswell, New Mexico, of course, which has got to be either the capital of the universe or maybe an interstellar rest stop on the way to Betelgeuse or something like that. I love that town, don't you?
It was so great to go there, and that was one of those places like I wanted to be able to go at some point, but having a project like this, it turned it into research. Well, now I have to go, which was kind of great, but I love it. You drive in. I mean, I don't know if any of our viewers have been, but I drove from Albuquerque, so it's about a 3-hour drive.
I made the same drive. Yeah.
Yeah. And that last, I'd say 100 miles is basically just straight empty road. I literally had, I think I wrote this in the book, literally had the tumbleweed, like the cliche
right, you did
in front of my car, like you see in cartoons or like old westerns or whatever, that actually happened to me. And it's just nothing. And then all of a sudden you see the Roswell sign. There's a picture of that in the book. And then it's just the whole town is just embracing. You kind of just go straight into that main street, and all this, the street lamps are all alien heads. The Dunkin' Donuts is held up by like a 20-foot alien. The McDonald's is shaped like a flying saucer. Even like the hotels and banks had signs out front, like, yes, Earthlings, we have vacancies, things like that. Like everyone just embraces it. And so I love being there. And obviously the main reason was to, I visited the museum and research center there. The research center has got tens of thousands of files. So that was great, a little overwhelming, but great. And also I got to meet up with someone who had a UFO experience in 1964.
And that's what I was hoping to get to, because you got to talk to Charles Davis, this guy who believes at least that he had an alien encounter right when he was 8 years old behind a laundry.
Yes. And he didn't actually say that it was definitely an alien encounter. He just basically said something weird happened and I don't know what it was. And so clearly, one thought could be, is it some sort of extraterrestrial encounter that he had? But yeah, he was 8 years old. This was actually in Hobbs, New Mexico. Just to clarify, this wasn't in Roswell. He just lives there now. But yeah, he was playing out there in 1964, and the back lot of his grandmother's laundromat, and he sees this top-shaped UFO about treetop level high or so. And it's kind of mimicking his movement. So if he moves this way, it moves that way. If he moves this way, it moves that way. Back and forth. And all of a sudden, the thing zips over his head and just belches out this flame over his head. And his grandmother at that point had stepped out in the back and saw it. And it burned him from the chin up. And she rushed him to the hospital. They had a burn specialist on staff at the moment, which was fortunate for him. He was cared for, obviously, right away. And, the FBI came and investigated the whole situation. There's a newspaper picked up the story. This wasn't just something he was telling me. This was actually documented at the time. And the FBI found no trace of anything that would have caused the damage that he suffered. There was nothing left on the ground. There was nothing that could have come out of like maybe some system from the laundromat that may have caused the flames. So it's basically just was this giant unknown thing that happened to him. And I was tipped off by this story by someone I was visiting in Albuquerque who has this remarkable UFO archive of information, which is, his name is David Marler. It's now called the National UFO Historical Record Center. And so he told me about him, and he had been researching this case. This guy, by the way, Charles Davis, had spoken to really no one since 1968 or so, other than David and then me. This was not something he thought about or wanted to try to capitalize on in any way. It was just a thing that happened to him that was weird. But what David discovered was that other top-shaped like objects were also being spotted on Tuesday nights in the months before and after in like North Carolina and Georgia, and also in certain cases belching out flames and causing injury to people. So much so, like on the nose on Tuesdays, that people were having watch parties for this thing. Again, this was documented in newspapers that people were out looking for the top shaped thing. No explanation for this ever. So I love starting off this book with this really truly bizarre, obscure story, because the weirdness of it is what this book is kind of, encompasses this whole book. Like what's going on.
And we're going to talk about some more of these true believers as well, because a lot of the book is devoted to them. I worried when we selected this book. I worried about our hard science, Carl Sagan worshiping members out there, and I'm one of them, of course, how they'd react to us discussing a book that explores the UFP, now UAP, if you prefer, phenomenon with one skeptical eye closed. What did you hope to accomplish with this book?
Well, I think for me, like I love just sharing these kinds of stories and the beliefs either way. So I think from my experience, a lot of UFO books, they're either very much pushing forward the belief of UFOs, and this is definitely happening, and this is the agenda to believe, or the opposite, all very skeptical, none of this is happening, here's why. I feel like my goal was really to just walk the line down the middle, because I don't have an agenda. I'm not trying to sway you one way or the other. I find the stories fascinating. I find it amazing that people had experiences they had, believed what they believed, the things that happened around those events that happened. And if they're explainable by science, I think that's fascinating. If they're not, also very interesting. What's going on? There's still more to be learned. And I do have a chapter, which I think is probably unique, to have a chapter solely devoted to scientific thought and efforts to find extraterrestrial life.
We'll talk about that too. It's great that you included that.
I felt like, I don't know if other books have the breadth of names in one book, from more heavy scientific thought to some of the more, quirkier beliefs particularly like in the 50s with contactees. So I tried to cover a wide range, again, because to me, it's all fascinating, whether you believe or not.
There is a paragraph in my ARC, Advanced Reader Copy. It's page 14. It's the very last paragraph in your introduction. And I really think it captures what you've just been talking about, what you hope to accomplish with this book. Have you got it in front of you? I was going to get you to read that if you would.
I do. Yeah. The last paragraph on 14.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so this is the end of the introduction section. I say, so consider this volume your voyage through the chapters of humanity and our encounters with whatever or whoever else might be zooming through our skies. As you read the evidence, the lack of evidence, the passionate testimonies, and the skeptical responses, you won't find the smoking gun explain the UFO phenomenon. But when pondering if we're alone in the universe, you just might find yourself armed with more informed and endlessly fascinating questions.
That's it. Okay, so maybe not a smoking gun, but I think one of the other things that you talk about in the book, toward the end of the book, is the 180 or something close to it that the United States government has done in just the past handful of years, right? Talk about this then, as you do in the book.
Yeah, I mean, so the government has acknowledged the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena. Like you said earlier, they call it UAP now. That's largely to shift away from the stigma of the term UFO, flying saucers, which has its own association. So UAP tries to change the conversation. But it's a pretty amazing admission for the government to say, yes, there are things in our airspace that we can't identify. Whether they're alien or not, that's a pretty crazy thing to admit, and that's a problem. Like we should know what's going on. And that's a big reason. I spoke with Christopher Mellon, who was really instrumental in having those videos that I'm sure most people have seen that were released by Navy pilots from 2004, I think primarily. Those three particular videos that were then released with the New York Times article in 2017, which kind of broke this whole thing open. And the whole thought there was like, this is really a matter of national defense and national security, that we don't know what's going on above us. Like something's happening. We should be aware of what it is, whatever it is. If it's aliens, that's one amazing thing. If it's a technology from a foreign power, an adversary, that's maybe an even bigger issue. At least if it was aliens, they haven't done anything to us yet, so maybe we're fine. So I think it's a really amazing thing for them to acknowledge and finally investigate. And it was interesting this year in February, if you remember, there was a week in February where basically UFOs, there were 4 UFOs. Well, there was the Chinese spy balloon, which was shot down, which was identified. But then after that, like within a week, there were 3, and then the newspaper, like the media, was calling it UFOs basically because they were unidentified flying objects, and they remain unidentified. They were shot down. Like I think one of them was over Dead Horse, Alaska, which is population of 8, if I remember correctly, and just like a place where they can't even go search. But what were they? And at least now they're starting to find these things and understand something is up there, and maybe they're causing safety issues for pilots at the very least. But potentially it could be something worse if they pay no attention to it.
Yeah. And just to reiterate what you said, I mean, this is admitting that there's something going on that we don't understand is still a light year or more away from saying these are space aliens. So,
Exactly.
which you acknowledge in the book. The bulk of the book, as I said, introduces us to lots of true believers, the people like Charles Davis, and other folks who study them and their experiences. I'm thinking there's so many. I'm thinking of Kenneth Arnold, who you actually call the father of flying saucers. Talk about him a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's where the term came from, is from his experience. So that was in June of 1947, and he was flying. He was a pilot from Boise, Idaho, but he was flying over Washington by Mount Rainier, and he saw these 9 flying discs, as he called them. And I think he had said something when he landed that, he'd already said something on one leg of his journey, which then got passed along before he got to his next leg, and was mobbed by the press, and said something how they looked like they were, saucers skipping over the water. And someone said, "Oh, they're flying saucers," someone in the press. And that's changed, our language forever, and the skies as we look up. So that's where flying saucers really came from. But that moment, and that's not to say that was the first time someone saw something unusual in the sky. I'd get into some earlier stories as well. But that was really a pretty key moment. As soon as that happened, the next day you had people reporting flying saucers all over the country. And within a week, I think more than 30 states had flying saucer reports. So this thing really took off. Whether this was some, we don't know what was going on specifically. There certainly were hoaxes involved. Maybe people were just seeing things because they were reading things and wanted to see things. Maybe there were things flying over. We don't know, but it definitely kicked off an amazing phenomena. And that all led into Roswell a few weeks later.
Who else? I mean, there's, like I said, there are so many whose stories you tell in the book or recount. Who else really stands out in your mind? You'd pick a couple.
Oh, there's so many. Well, just to kind of go a little bit in chronological order, after the by the 50s, you started to have, like 1950, you started having this group I mentioned briefly before called the contactees. And this was this group of people who were saying that they had encounters with space people. They often referred to them as space people, all from within our solar system. And often from Venus, which is odd, especially having read the Big Book of Mars and realizing how much pop culture is built around Mars and early scientific belief in Martians. Yet Venusians were quite popular in the 50s. And the Venusians looked very much like us, but more beautiful, which I also thought was interesting. Oh, they look just like us, but just better. It's like this idealized version. And there were quite a few of these characters with a lot of outlandish stories, but I love these stories. And I print some covers of a lot of their books. They seem to try to one-up each other as the years were going on. Like I saw a flying saucer. The flying saucer landed. I went aboard it. I met the Venusian. The Venusian took me for a ride. I went to the moon. I went to the moon and Mars. I went to the moon, Mars, and Venus. I married a Venusian. I had a Venusian family. So it just kept going. Like, how can we top each other? And generally speaking, they had a good message. Their message was basically these space people are coming to tell us that we are entering a very dangerous age with the, in the atomic age. This was all coming out of World War II and the bomb, and that we're a danger to ourselves. We might be a danger to the planets around us as well. So basically, the message of peace and being careful with the nuclear power and how we handle it. I mean, that's something you can't argue with that. If that was just their medium or their vehicle to give that message, but they would hold lectures.
Klaatu had, I was going to say Klaatu. He had the same message for us in
exactly
Forbidden Planet,
right?
Not Forbidden Planet. I'm sorry.
Dating stood still. Yeah, and I quote him. I think at the beginning of that chapter. So it's an interesting group of people, and I think that that's also a large reason why science distanced itself from the subject, because these people were pretty kooky. They were a little nutty. And if you were interested in the topic before, now all of a sudden you might be associated with these characters and you don't want to be. So it gets pushed back and not focused on. And now that's changed significantly. And I do wonder if it wasn't for those particular characters and that sensationalism around it, would science have looked at it more seriously decades ago, and would we maybe know something more today than we do now? And that's something, whether it's extraterrestrial life or just some unknown physics, who's to say? But either way, we may have learned something new.
I do get the feeling, some of these folks, like the guy who married a Venusian and had a Venusian family, some of them really seem like hucksters in it for a buck. And, you go up to like the Eric von Daniken's of the world, who always just infuriated me. But, I'm looking at a question here, and I'm looking at the chat right now. And by the way, unfortunately, we've lost Amber. She had an emergency. So I think my colleague, Mark Hilverda, has stepped in. So, Mark, I'm going to be checking out those questions that you're collecting as well. But I'm also looking at the chat. And I've got a question from Mark, too, but our Mark. But I'm looking at the one that I was about to ask you. That's from Craig Griffin, who's wondering, he says, if during your research, Mark, I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong one. It's Wayne Turner. Craig will get back to you. And he says, Mark, you spent a lot of time talking about and with the true believers of the UFOs. I mean, how do you evaluate these folks? I mean, the people who really seem sincere and are not seeking attention, like the fellow we talked about initially.
That's a good question. I talked to such a variety of people, and you have to, you have to give them all. You respect them all. These are all things that they believe. I don't believe I talked to people that were just trying to BS me, for lack of a better term. I think that they did believe everything they were saying to me. Something happened to them in some way. So who's to say? So what I try to do is really not judge necessarily. Here's their story. In some cases, for example, like abduction cases is a pretty common one. So I have a section on abductees. And so that kind of followed the contactees starting in the 60s. So 50s was kind of like fun meeting Venusians. In 60s, contact all of a sudden became abduction, which is a little closer in terms of a close encounter experience.
Yeah.
And so I talked to people that I know and truly believed that these things happened, and it's a little tough sometimes. Like, did this really happen? But they certainly believe something happened, and a lot of that comes through hypnotic regression. So I talked to some people who perform hypnotic regressions. Okay, so if I tell that story, let me also hear from some of the hypnotists and their beliefs, and those thoughts kind of range. Some of them were very much like, yeah, everything they're telling me is these are things that happen. Others acknowledge that there are other things that might be going on within the mind. You have to be very careful. Are the hypnotist suggesting anything that might elicit some ideas? Everything's going into our minds constantly. So things potentially get a little swirled and maybe come out in a different way than things may have actually happened. So there's all these different variables. Some of it might also be masking various experiences from the past, traumatic experiences, and it's coming out as an explanation with extraterrestrials. So I talk about some of those things, not to judge anyone, but just to provide different viewpoints, basically. In some cases, it's also, is the story an interesting story? Like one of the more odd stories I have in the book was someone I met at a MUFON conference in Denver, Colorado.
And so
last year.
MUFON, remind us what that is.
It's the Mutual UFO Network. So it's a large organization. People can report their sightings to that group. They have investigators and so forth. So I met a woman who was selling a beautiful book called The Art of the Close Encounter. It's a book just compiling various artists and their expressions of aliens and UFOs and so forth. And it turned out she had a lot of experiences herself. So she stepped aside with me and talked to me for like 40 minutes about these experiences that she had. So I recounted a bunch of those in the book. But what I loved about her story in particular is bizarre as her stories were, about being abducted weekly, multiple times weekly for years, and having hybrid children and being a hybrid child and all these things. She was also the camerawoman for Baywatch.
Oh, I remember her now. Yeah, right.
You remember the show Baywatch with David Hasselhoff and Pamela Anderson.
Yeah.
And so she was a camerawoman. And so there was one, and everyone knew about her in the abductions. She said David Hasselhoff would ride up on the beach and, oh, did you get abducted again? These were just conversations they would have. And one day she said she was late, and her producer said, come on, hurry up, Kim, you got to come down to the beach. You got to see what we have for you. And they had all these radio telescopes set up on the beach. They were filming an episode of Baywatch where there was an encounter and an abduction happened based on her experiences. And so that was a situation where, like, okay, these stories are definitely a little out there, interesting for sure, but they had this really unique tie into popular culture, which I love. So believe it or whatever you choose to believe, it did impact the pop culture world as we know it in a small way. It's been immortalized in an episode of Baywatch. So to me, that was like one way to say, okay, this is, I think, a fun thing to include. It's obscure. But with someone that people would at least be aware of the reference to.
I had reason.
Not a very long-winded answer.
I had reason once to be on the set of Baywatch, and they have great craft service, by the way. That's the catering. But it was a big family, and so it's easy to believe that they took this woman's story and turned it into one of their episode scripts. That's really wonderful. We are getting a lot of questions from people that I want to start getting to, but I want to ask you about one other individual before we do. Not someone, I think, if I remember correctly, who had an experience himself, but became a believer, and that's Luis Elizondo, the former counterintelligence guy for the Department of Defense.
Yeah. So Lou, I was thrilled I got to speak with him. So Lou was the guy who was running the ATIP program in the government. That was the program that was exposed by the New York Times in 2017. Well, he exposed it. That's how it exposed. So he basically resigned and worked with Christopher Mellon, contacted Leslie Kean at the New York Times, and met with her in DC. And Christopher had gotten the DVDs of the Navy sightings,
the Navy pilot, footage.
Yes. Yeah. So he handed those over with Lou to Leslie for the New York Times. He held one back to present later with, I think, the Washington Post months later. So I think Times had 2 of the 3 videos. And Lou basically said, like, I want to talk about what's going on here. They had, I think, cut funding, and he felt like he couldn't do what he was asked to do anymore. So he'd have to find another way to get, to get work done to still investigate what was going on, basically. And so, of course, he couldn't, there's certain things he couldn't say. He couldn't tell me. I asked questions, but he did say that there were lots of things he'd seen that were much more convincing than what was released to the public.
Wow.
So there's a lot of, and he speaks with a lot of conviction, and he does not seem like he's just, trying to tell stories. He seems very serious. And this was a guy who was, a counterterrorism expert who, fought against Al Qaeda. And I mean, this was a guy who was out there in the field doing all this counterterrorism intelligence work. And he just took this as like, that's his job. He has to find out what these things are. That's the lens he looks at through, not as someone who is looking for UFOs, So it's an interesting perspective he's coming from. with a lot of experience behind him. And he just believes that what he's seen and what he's heard, there's reason to investigate it further and to take it seriously. So I was able to share, quite a few thoughts and perspectives from him in the book.
Fascinating. Because Marco Hilverda has stepped up, Hilverda, I keep getting that wrong. I apologize, Mark. Because he stepped up, I'm going to throw his question at you first. And I happen to know that he's Canadian. He says, I appreciate how this book covers everything, including history, stories, pop culture, reports, and science. It's a convenient way to absorb an overview of this subject, and the book layout is nicely designed. He's a pretty good designer himself, Mark. While some of the content looked outside of North America, the book is very heavy on U.S.-related information. Does this perhaps indicate a cultural influence that leads to more data points, not necessarily better quality data, or are international reports more difficult to investigate? I mean, would you agree that most of the focus is on stuff that's happened, not just, North America, because there is some Canadian stuff?
I mean, yes, the book focuses heavily on American experiences, but I did make a conscious decision to cover various international events as well, mainly to, I didn't want it to look like it was just an American phenomenon. I think that's important. It is a global phenomenon. For example, I talked about one case in Brazil, but there's hundreds, if not thousands, of cases in Brazil. Just as one example, Russia has many cases. I touched on that very briefly. It's really a matter of pages. I've got a word count I have to go by. I actually went 20,000 words above, and then I got them to meet me in the middle with an extra 10,000 words. But there's so much. It's really overwhelming. So yes, it skews more towards American. Likely, just I'm here. That information is a bit more accessible. English is obviously makes it easier. It'd be hard for me to go into other countries and research when I don't speak the language. So yeah, it's the book is more heavily American, but that's not to say that this is an American experience only by any means.
So maybe We Are Not Alone, the sequel, the international experience. But just saying, let me start getting to some of the other questions that Amber was feeding us before she had to go. The first one that she came up with was from Claudia Ornelas. Given the cultural and social implications of belief in extraterrestrial life, how do you address concerns that your book might contribute to the spread of misinformation or potentially influence individuals to embrace unfounded beliefs? Well stated, Claudia. You don't want to become part of the problem, in other words, or contribute to misinformation, I don't think.
I don't. I'm hoping that it's not misinformation. I feel like it's fairly objective. I mean, I'm presenting stories from the past that have happened.
Yeah, I don't think she's saying that it's.
Yeah.
I don't think she's saying you're purveying misinformation. Anybody who heard what you had to say at the top of this hour, I think, understands. But just that, even if indirectly, this might be encouraging more people to think, oh, yeah, they're walking among us, which, I mean, personally, I don't believe, but I'm going to try to keep an open mind.
That's my hope, is that people come away with it with an open mind. So if they didn't have an open mind, I think there's reason to have one. That said, I don't think that you should go too far one direction or the other. I think that there's just a lot of unknowns still to be answered, and I think there's a lot of just amazing stories in here that keep that wonder alive. So I don't know that. I don't know that it would push someone to believe more so than they already believe. I think there's more stories that might interest them. I don't know. I never saw it as contributing to an issue like that. If anything, I think it would make people who, maybe if they weren't interested in the topic before, maybe they'll be interested now. I tend to think that the stories from the past, what I find more interesting about those is what they'll inspire creatively. Oftentimes these are the things that inspire stories, science fiction ideas, whatever, just think of how much these kinds of stories have inspired popular culture in terms of film, TV, books. So again, that all comes from information, things you're reading. So I like to think of it more as, hopefully inspiring, just interesting thought.
And I think just, even if you want, just look at this as a study in human psychology and sociology. I think it's fascinating just for that. But that arts angle is also great. You got 3 terrific pages devoted to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, one of my favorite movies. And this was something Spielberg, I mean, look, he also did E.T. This is a guy who's, I know, happens to be open to this stuff. And I'm thinking of, Richard Dreyfuss with the alien craft in the movie hovering over him and him coming away with that sunburn. And I think back to that 8-year-old who had those burns that he received.
Yeah. Spielberg pulled from real stories.
Yeah.
A lot of the events that happened were pulled from stories that have been documented, through newspaper articles and cases by Project Blue Book or even NICAP. So it wasn't like he was just making stuff up. This was all inspired by actual happenings. Close Encounters of the Third Kind came from Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was the chief astronomer consultant to the Air Force with Project Blue Book for the 40s to 1969, who shifted his views, is very much an early debunker to actually thinking there might be something to all this. And then he has, I don't know if people know, but he actually has a cameo at the end of Close Encounters. And
I did not.
The 2 main characters, I forgot the characters' names now, but there was the French scientist,
and played by Francois Truffaut. Yeah.
Yeah, who's inspired by Jacques Vallée, who was a scientist and investigator. And then the other one was modeled after J. Allen Hynek. And like I said, the real guy actually has the cameo at the end with, with his pipe and looking, just that was his signature look.
Yeah, I did not realize that. We couldn't have this conversation without bringing up J. Allen Hynek, because he has played such a huge role in this. And as you said, this fact that he turned around. He was initially a great skeptic. In fact, didn't he, you said in the book, he came up with the famous swamp gas explanation, which he later regretted?
Yeah, and actually, I just spoke with his son a couple nights ago. I'm working on a new book. And he talked about how his dad, there was just a lot of pressure from the Air Force. They basically just want to make it go away, debunk everything, just give us an explanation, whatever you got. And he gave that one. I'd say in the book, he was trying to say, oh, this part might be swamp gas, but it got taken as a blanket statement. And that got everybody's ire. This was over a case in Michigan. And no one believed that it could be swamp gas for what they saw. Lots of people, multiple witnesses, and it actually got the ire of Gerald Ford, who was I think a state representative of Michigan, and that led to a congressional hearing, and then eventually led to the Kaplan report, which eventually led to the closing of Project Blue Book. So swamp gas had a big impact.
And Gerald Ford, not the only person who would become a president or became interested as president. Also something you document in the book, which we won't go into right now. I had another question here from somebody who's joined us, Violet Paola, and it's related to Claudia's question, I think. Your book explores the historical aspects of belief in extraterrestrial life. Excuse me, but some critics argue that such beliefs are rooted more in pseudoscience and speculation than empirical evidence. As Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. How do you respond to skeptics who question the validity of the accounts that she says that you present, but really it's accounts that you document from these experiences of other people's? I mean, I bet this isn't the first time you've run into somebody who says, nah, there are other explanations for all of this.
Are we talking about like ancient cases or turn the century cases?
I would say more in the last 100 years, but ancient cases as well, if that seems appropriate. But I would say maybe more, these experiences, the people that you've talked to or talked to people who knew them, who absolutely believed in these experiences or believe in these experiences they had.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you one example of someone that had an experience in the 70s. This was a guy I've known for years, His name is Lee Spiegel. He was a journalist investigating UFOs since the 70s. He actually organized the first event at the UN to discuss the UFO topic. That was organized with the Prime Minister of Geneva. I'm sorry, not Geneva. Oh my gosh, Grenada. Sorry. Anyway, Lee had an experience in the 70s in North Carolina, and he was sent there by J. Allen Hynek to investigate this triangular-shaped craft that people were seeing. And he flies down there. This was Lumberton, North Carolina. And he meets with the police chief, and they're getting all the reports. They're driving out in the roads where people are reporting things. They're not seeing anything. And eventually they do. When they pull off the side of the road and they see this triangular craft, perfectly silent, treetop level above them, hovering there, flashes a beam of light down at his feet. There's him and the police officer, and I think a few other police officers and witnesses, all seeing this thing. And then it just zips off silently. And they try to pursue it, but they can't keep up, and it's just gone. And it's one of these odd cases. He investigated it. He checked with the Air Force. Are there training missions happening? Are there experimental crafts that you're testing right now? Nothing. There was like nothing that lined up with what they saw, with the timing of the events, none of that. So he wrote his full report, and this is one of these cases that just went, unexplained. And it's what's interesting for me is this is a guy I know. I don't believe he's just making up a story. I don't think he's just being imaginative. I think he saw something. I don't know what it is, but I find that fascinating. That this isn't. It's one thing when you hear like, oh, you read something in the book or you hear something from someone else, but it's different when it's someone you actually know, and you don't believe that person to be the type that would just make up something and share this made up story for decades. I believe it impacted him in a genuine way. Again, what it is, you don't know, but something happened.
Here's the question that's kind of the flip side of that. From Craig Griffin, the one I started to read before. He's wondering if during your research you experienced any stonewalling or resistance from anybody to sharing information. I mean, did you run into anybody who said, no, I don't want to talk to you, or I've been told I can't talk to you?
I did run into someone who didn't want to talk to me. There were a few people that never got back to me. So I don't say, who knows if that was too busy, missed the email for, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not making any judgments on people that I just never heard back from, but certainly some people I was hoping to speak with didn't get back to me. That said, I was thrilled with how many people I did get to speak with. But there was one member of the science community, and I honestly don't remember his name right now. But he was involved in a branch of SETI. I think it was METI, if I remember correctly.
Could be. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Anyway, someone had suggested I speak with him, so I reached out, and I had a title on my book, my author website, that says America's Leading Connoisseur of the Bizarre, which was from ABC News from years back, which I love. I love the bizarre. I love the weird.
Yeah.
And he wrote me and said, anyone who's called the leading connoisseur of the bizarre is someone I think I should not talk to. So thank you for the invitation, but I have to decline. I thought, well, okay. I mean, your job is looking for extraterrestrial intelligence. Does that not qualify at least as a little unusual? So that was a little disappointing. I can't think of another real rejection where someone just didn't want to talk to me.
Well, let's talk about the scientists who did talk to you. I mean, I hope everybody made it to chapter 4, your exploration of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, which has been at the core of the Planetary Society ever since our founding. And you ended up talking to a lot of my favorite people, the late Frank Drake, the very much alive and punning Seth Shostak, and somebody who contributed a lot to the previous book, The Big Book of Mars, Pascal Lee, also of the SETI Institute, just like Jill Charter, who I think you also spoke to, and Seth. And I'm thinking in particular of, you have one page which has Pascal's 14 possible explanations for the Fermi paradox, which I will give a real quick explanation of, because I think most of our audience probably knows. Fermi paradox, which is, Enrico Fermi sitting at lunch one day with some other scientists talking about UFOs and aliens and where are they? And he actually wrote on a napkin, where is everybody? How come we haven't heard from them if the galaxy is full of extraterrestrial intelligences? But I mean, maybe start with why it was important to include this chapter in the book, talking to real scientists who are seriously looking for extraterrestrial life and intelligence.
Well, a couple of things. One, part of it is purely because I'm fascinated by it, and so I want to share it. So I wanted to include that for sure. But I also think it's important to, again, balance it a little bit. And honestly, this was kind of the journey I took. Was I always felt like I had, like the angel and devil on the shoulders, not to say the angel and devil, but I felt like I had a scientist on one shoulder and like an experiencer on the other. And so it's like, you hear these amazing stories that are explained, and no, they're really compelling and intriguing. And then you hear like the scientists over here saying, well, let's get some more data and we need to understand, and it takes time. I'm like, yeah, that's true. And it balanced me as I was going through. And so I think, and so I hope that also balances the reader. If you're being swayed this way, well, also consider this. And that works both ways. I just think there's so many ways to think about it, and I want to present a lot of those, and just again give you more information to take in, and again to judge what, make a judgment for yourself on where you want to go. Again, there's no answer really there, and that's again kind of the beauty of it. But I did think it was truly fascinating to, one, kind of document some of the early history, because there is a lot of early history, and I got into a lot of this, as you know, in the Big Book of Mars. There's a lot of major scientific belief in intelligent life on Mars and other planets. That was kind of a normal thought hundreds of years ago.
Not even 100, not even hundreds. Yeah. Early 20th century, Mars craze. Yeah.
And it's interesting because now that we know so much more about our own solar system, but we also know there's so much more out there. Well, now we just project those thoughts to much further, right? Like before, it's like, oh, maybe Mars, that thing in the sky. Well, now it's like, well, maybe it's Zeta Reticuli. Things that are even further out until we find out what's over there. So you can just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. But I find it all amazing, and I loved the Drake equation, which I explained. I'm guessing a lot of people here are probably aware of that, but I love the fact that they thought, okay, there could be anywhere from 10,000 to, I think it was like 100 million intelligent civilizations in our galaxy. That's a massive number. But at the same time, Drake was clear in saying, I don't think that they can overcome the distance between us, though, so we're safe. But he was so open-minded that there's something there, and thought it was worth pursuing, finding a way to make contact or at least find evidence of, an existing or past civilization. I think that's interesting thought that people should be aware of. I think people outside the scientific community don't know anything about Frank Drake. So if they know a lot about UFOs, I think they should know a lot about that too.
Absolutely.
I think that's important. And I love Pascal Lee's take on it, which is so different. And I was glad he gave me permission to reprint his 14 list, because I love the sense of humor behind it. I thought that was great. But he takes such an interesting approach to it. And what I loved about it, again, as someone who's, I'm not a scientist. And so I think a lot of people reading would not have any of the thoughts that he's sharing. And what I mean by that is, for example, it's easy to say, look at how many stars there are in the galaxy, right? And by sheer numbers, surely there must be life out there somewhere. Just like the odds seem very high, right? And that's very reasonable thought. But what I thought was so interesting was the way he looked at that and kind of broke it down in his lecture, which I was able to cover briefly. He gives a full lecture on this, but I love this idea that he talks about, first of all, how we're on the edge of the galaxy, and that's a safe part of the galaxy. And in the center of the galaxy, you got these gamma ray bursts, which just could, if intelligent life is forming on any exoplanets out there, they might be wiped out immediately by a gamma ray burst. That would and that happens a lot, he was saying, so, or often. So there's like that aspect. No one thinks about that. I don't think, again, people who don't know those things exist would never think that like we happen to be in a good spot of the galaxy, even though there's a lot of other planets and stars out there. They might not be safe to harbor life or to at least evolve life. So that's an interesting way to look at it. And then also the chance, the amazing randomness that we exist is really incredible. Like the fact that, the meteor hit the earth and wiped out the dinosaurs and some mammals scurried away and hid and evolved into us. Like, I mean, that's lucky that happened. That didn't have to happen, right? Like, we might not be here. And then I love the fact he talked about that we are above ground. He gives the example, and this actually came up at the with the Frank and Drake's the Drake equation at the conference he had in 1961. The idea of like dolphins, having intelligence, right?
Yeah.
Like they're very intelligent, but they're underwater, so they can't get up on the ground and look up at the stars and like think about things that way because they can't. Like,
and they
have
also
that access,
and they can't make fire. They can't smelt metal.
Right. So they have a certain level of intelligence, but they don't have the things that we have. So we're fortunate that way. So did other life evolve in other places with the same amount of variables that led to us being who we are? And that is an amazing number of circumstances that came together to be what we are. So I don't know. I like those perspectives on it.
I'm going to temper what you had to say about the Drake equation with what Lou Friedman, my old boss at the Planetary Society, his solution to the Drake equation, where he came up with exactly one intelligent civilization in the galaxy, us. Yeah. But as I said to Lou, even if you're off, Lou, by 4 orders of magnitude, that's 10,000 if I figured it out right. We're probably still so far apart from each other in this gigantic galaxy that, yeah, it's we can hope that someday we hear from one another. The other thing that I wish had happened is that one of those contactees who met Venusians and maybe married one or two of them, that's one of them had said, "Hey, how do you get your air conditioners to work so well on a planet that's 850 degrees on the surface?" That would have been nice to hear about.
They could have shared some technology.
Yeah. While we're talking about this stuff, here's a question from Wayne Turner. Talk about Avi Loeb. He has some interesting things to say. Avi Loeb of Harvard University, who was my guest on Planetary Radio when he wrote his first book about Oumuamua, that object that he claims, that he still believes is quite possibly an alien interstellar spacecraft. I can tell you my thoughts up front, just to make that clear. Avi told me, well, I'm not seeking attention here. Yeah, kind of was. And the excellent explanations from other people I had on Planetary Radio of that object, which did not require intelligent civilizations from other stars. But please, you also dealt with Avi.
Yeah, I was thrilled to speak with him, and he had a lot to say. Talked about Oumuamua for sure, and again, just some of the resistance he encountered, and why should something that does not reflect any properties that we know then not lead you to think that maybe it's something else? That's kind of, I think, the thrust of his argument. But what I think is great about what Avi Loeb is doing is that, again, I talked about before, like that gap in time. Like if we had people like Avi Loeb 50 years ago studying this, what might we know today? But you didn't have that back then. But here's a guy now who comes forward with a ton of credentials, ton of knowledge, funding now, since that book was published. There's a lot of funding.
And his new foundation, his new nonprofit.
The Galileo Project. Yeah, so he was able to form that. And so here's a guy who's got the know-how and the clouts and the means and accessibility. And he can actually start to look at data and collect data. He basically said, I'm not going to wait for the government to give me anything because they're not going to. And what am I going to do with that? So I'll get my own data. I think his quote in the book was something about the skies are not classified. So he's got resources to actually collect data and try to see, like, can we discover something new? Can we find other interstellar objects passing through and find out about them early enough to actually get more data on them, or even potentially some imagery of them? Oumuamua was a little bit too late, so we had very little to work with. So I think that's amazing. He's got more than 100 scientists working with him, and that's something that really hasn't happened before. He doesn't worry about a stigma, and because he's not, and he's vocal, and he's got Harvard credentials, other scientists I think are feeling comfortable working with him. They're not shying away from the subject. So again, that to me gives us a better opportunity to learn more. And again, we don't know what we'll learn, but I think we'll learn something from it, which to me that's worthwhile.
I like Seth Shostak's attitude toward Avi and the work that he's taken on, which is, I think, is kind of okay, Avi, I don't really buy what you've said so far, but you go for it, and let's see what kind of data you can come up with.
Why not, right? I mean, that should be the attitude of a scientist, right? Let's learn what we don't know.
Yeah, as long as it's approached with good science. Yeah, hey, here's one. Yeah, here's one from Gene Lewin, old friend from Planetary Radio, one of our space poets for that show. He says, really enjoyed the Big Book of Mars. We Are Not Alone. And he's getting ready to read Chasing Ghosts. Maybe,
Thanks.
And here's in the form of a question, maybe it will delve into experiences in a seasonal Dickens carol. There's a question for the season, bah humbug.
I'm trying to remember if I had a section on Dickens. I can't remember if that all was still left in the book or if that part got cut. Because there is some great stuff about Dickens, not just about the story, but around Dickens' his own life, which is there's a lot of ghost paranormal sort of events that led to him, obviously inspired him and sort of shaped some of his stories.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Here's one from the chat from Susan Stalker. And by the way, we are coming up on the hour here, Mark, partly because we cheated people of 5 minutes when we had that video problem. Are you able to stick around for a few more minutes?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
10, 15. Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you. Susan says, I love the book. You've definitely convinced me that not all bizarre encounters are constructed memories, like my memory of an alien encounter that was verbatim a scene from an episode of VeggieTales, are caused by sleep paralysis, like a ghost cat I once met, and that some are truly unexplained. She says, I can't help but wonder if you plan on keeping tabs on any UFO reports that crop up, and would you write a sequel if you got enough information? Are you sticking with this? Are you continuing to follow what the community comes up with?
To some degree, I am. There's so much; it's kind of hard to keep up with all of it, to be honest. And sometimes people send me stuff, and it's a lot. There's a lot going on right now, especially just again with the various government efforts. I feel like they change the names and the acronyms of these task force. Every few months, it's another new acronym. So I try to keep up a bit with that. Just again, especially as interviews are going on with this book and trying to keep up with everything. So I do my best to do that. But I am working on a new book now, and that will cover one chapter will cover this topic again, but through the lens of a government, unusual government programs. So Project Blue Book and some of the OSAP ATIP programs up to what's going on now. So I'm covering it with like a slightly different lens, more of like through the government's perspective, I guess you would say. And what it's trying to do, we're trying to achieve, so it's a little different, covering some similar material, but again with a little bit of a different lens. So it's been kind of fun to dive back in, talking to some people I spoke with for We Are Not Alone again, and some new people as well. So it's good. In terms of a whole new book, I don't know. I'd have to see. There's certainly a lot more I could cover. So I mean, actually, would be kind of fun to cover more of the obscure stories. I always feel like with these kinds of books, I felt this way with Chasing Ghosts a lot. Also, you want to cover some of the more well-known. I actually felt this way too with the Big Book of Mars in terms of the pop culture section in particular. You want to cover some of the big ones that people are aware of, because you want them to be able to read about that as well, and maybe share some new thoughts on it that they hadn't read elsewhere, but then also balance that with more obscure things that they're not going to read in other books or find elsewhere. So you try to balance the two. If I didn't have to worry about that balance so much, I could just focus on more obscure stories that are lost in files and tucked away. I mean, that would be kind of fun to do.
the X-Files, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
Here's one. It mentions somebody that I've not heard of. And it's from Claudia, who we heard from before. I wonder what you think about. It's Jamie or Jaime Maussan, Maussan. I mean, he speaks really seriously, but it has been proven that most of his claims have been false. Does that name mean anything to you?
Is this guy in Mexico?
Beats me. Let's see if Claudia drops back into the chat here and lets us know. While we're doing that, I'm going to throw a couple of other ones at you because there's some of the more. Yes, she says. Violet Paolo says he is Mexican.
This was the guy with those alien bodies a few months ago at the Mexico's Congress, correct? That's what we're talking about.
Oh, right. I did hear about that story. I didn't remember the name though.
This is actually, I find to be an interesting little wrinkle in this story. So at that same event, if I remember correctly, was Ryan Graves, who was one of those Navy pilots who's now been working to investigate the phenomena, the UAP phenomena, and I think that's great. I think what he's doing is makes a lot of sense. But it's weird when I see him in the same room with the guy presenting these these mummified aliens that I really do not think are anything.
They look pretty phony to me.
Yes, exactly. So what I see happening, and goes back to the contactees in my mind. Here you had the guys with the Venusians and the flying saucers and everything. And by the way, those books have such great titles, like Inside the Spaceships, which is on the shelf behind me. I love it.
Yeah.
Great artwork. So you have those guys now intermingling with the Ryan Graves of the world, who are the more serious people, who are these well-trained pilots who are seeing something unusual, and now it's getting a little bit conflated with alien mummies in Mexico. And so what does that do to the progress that's been made on the topic? Where you push the stigma aside, you get more people taking it seriously, get the government interested, or at least paying attention. And now you got these guys coming up. Does that start to bring the stigma back? Does it start to drive people away again? Where does it go? We don't know yet, but that's kind of what was going through my mind when that was happening. It was like, oh, is this bad news?
I got to throw in the comment from Jeff Uyang. He says pinata aliens. Yeah, they're not mummies.
Oh.
I'm going to throw a couple at you as we get pretty close to the end here. We've been going for almost an hour. Well, actually, there's one more that came in ahead of time from Keith Abels, who is on with us live, I know. If aliens are more advanced than we are, do you think they developed telepathy? Why haven't we developed telepathy? Are we not worthy? Keith, I could tell that you were thinking that question ahead of time. Anyway, I throw that in because it's bizarre, and you are the purveyor of the bizarre. Here's another one for you. This is from me. There were a couple of encounters that you mentioned in the book, which make me wonder and want to ask you, do aliens stink? Or is it just some of their craft, their flying saucers, that smell bad?
These are both good questions. Just to jump back a second, telepathy, definitely there's a lot of stories where these guys were saying they were being communicated with telepathically from aliens. And that goes, I had stories from the Big Book of Mars like that too, with the one that started that whole book, Umaruru, was telepathically communicating with a lawyer in London in 1926. So
yeah,
that's in that
I remember
book.
that.
Yeah. So that's been a theme, actually. Not even before that, I talked about in the Big Book of Mars beliefs that Martians were communicating telepathically with each other, which was an easier way, especially with a thin atmosphere, and that's why they had the antennas. So there was scientific thought around the idea of telepathy with aliens, which is interesting. And I will say there's a lot of people here that think we do have telepathy already. Those experiments have been going on for 100 years, if not longer, and continue to go on today. So there is a belief in that already, that maybe we can do that, or can learn to do that. That's a whole other story. But in terms of stinky, I did talk about, I mentioned Brazil. The alien in Brazil was considered to be quite stinky. That's one of the main descriptions of it. And yeah, who knows? Is it, they've got different bacteria, I suppose, that might be stinky here. Maybe they got here and those bacteria, couldn't survive and left a stink. I'm not sure. It's a long flight, presumably, so that would also, like going a long car drive, the car might start to stink, right? So imagine going a few light years. Not unreasonable to think it might be stinky, I suppose. But then again, you figure if they're good enough to get here, they might be good enough to keep it clean and smelling good too.
Yeah, this reminds me of two cartoons from my past. One, I'm sure I remember a Gary Larson cartoon where we're looking at a flying saucer in space. And if you look very carefully, written in the dust on the back of the saucer is "Wash Me." But also, and this was from the Life Science Library that I grew up with, of an alien you see in the background in the desert, probably a desert on Earth, is his crashed flying saucer. And this poor alien is crawling across the desert saying, "Ammonia, ammonia." Okay, we're having fun here at the end, folks. What can I say? Let me go to something that is right at the end of the book. You quote CUFO, C-U-F-O. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. The Center for UFO Studies, I guess.
Yeah.
Mark Roediger, who heads that center. And basically, he wonders what would happen if aliens showed up and a friendly conversation got underway. And then someone eventually asked E.T., so, why didn't you make your presence more obvious in all those years that, in recent decades, after all those mysterious encounters? And the alien says, "What are you talking about? We haven't been here since 1947. Great anecdote.
Yeah. I mean, who's to say there's one visitor? And maybe we get one, maybe we answered part of the question, but not all of the questions. Maybe there's many more to still be answered. So again, a kind of a fun way to look at the whole situation.
So what are you left with? Are you more of a believer or still skeptical or just waiting to hear more to get that extraordinary evidence that we Sagan fans want?
I would love to get the extraordinary evidence because I would say, like, I would want to believe, like, I'd like to believe that there's something else out there. And it does seem like there's got to be something else out there. I do wonder if there is, or if there was. I mean, to me, for the timelines to align is also extraordinary. I mean, in the span of the universe, for the fact that we're here right now, which is just like a sliver of the time, and for something else to have also arrived where we are, or advanced, or close enough at the same time in history that we can communicate. I know there's a huge time issue with all that, but still, somehow that has to align. So could that be? I don't know, but I think the thing. So I guess I would say I would like to believe that something is out there and might be able to get here, or we could get there. What I find actually really exciting, and I got into this in chapter 4, is what we might start learning fairly soon, I think, through like James Webb and its successor, which will launch, I think, in 2030s.
If we're lucky. Lucky.
But what those can detect can start to really, I think, give us a good sense of whether or not life is on some of these exoplanets through biosignatures or technosignatures.
Yeah.
And that alone would be, to me, like, wow, if we at least we know something, then we might actually have real data that says, yeah, there is something alive on this planet. We might not know what it is, but that's pretty cool. Like, that would be pretty amazing. At least, like, okay, well, now we do know that there's some other life out there, that we have some, at least, I would imagine, verifiable data to go by, as opposed to just theory or belief or whatever it might be. So to me, that's exciting, that I feel like we may have some kind of answer sometime soon. But I remain open-minded.
And I really enjoyed that conversation that you have in the book with I'm looking up his name, Dr. Ravi Kaparapu of NASA Goddard, who's studying, okay, how would we recognize, if we have a powerful enough telescope, those technosignatures that might be on coming from some other world, like finding their CFCs and knowing that they've polluted their world like we have.
I was so glad to talk to him. He was really very helpful. Just to go back to one of those earlier questions about running into any obstacles with talking to people. So having done the Big Book of Mars and having had pretty great access to various scientists within NASA, I thought, oh, let me reach out to. I had reached out to Ravi and another scientist. He wrote an article with Jacob Hock-Mizra. They wrote something in Scientific American about this topic. And when I wrote to Ravi, so Jacob was fine. I talked to him, and Ravi then passed it along to the head of communications at Goddard. And I had to then go through her, and she was great. But at first she's like, I just had to, before we talk about this topic with anyone, I have to like check you out and make sure, in her words, that you're not a nut. So I was like, okay. And she's like, and I think she liked what I was doing. She was, very complimentary. So I was very happy about that, obviously. But then she was on the call with me and Robbie and recording the call as well. So that if I turned out to be a nut, and I wrote something crazy and said that this was what Robbie was saying, which was not at all what he was saying, that they would be covered and say, no, Mark's a nut. Here's the actual conversation that happened. But yeah, of course. So there was that I had to go through, which was interesting to me, that because of the nature of the topic, it was fairly guarded, I guess you would say. But again, Ravi was very open, and he actually read that section for me to make sure I got it right. I wanted to make sure I processed his information, and again, I'm trying to deliver fairly complex thinking to a mass audience that's maybe not doesn't have that kind of background. So I was thankful that he made sure I got everything correct and was able to tell that story properly.
It makes for, in that last portions of the book, it does make for a pretty good close of the book, along with the science and that turnaround that the federal government has made. I'm thinking about buying one of those $10 million alien abduction insurance policies. Can you put me in touch with them?
I can. I love that. I love that he's been doing this since the 80s, and he clearly, just for anyone who's just tearing that apart, that maybe didn't read that section of the book, he does this as clearly as a joke, which is pretty funny. Actually, the writing on it is very, very funny. But he also talks about how it was always a joke to him, but as the years went on and as things have been coming out more recently, he realizes it's actually been a good icebreaker for people who maybe feel like they've had an experience, and this is a way for them to kind of talk about it in a simpler way. And so I think he likes that it's actually maybe been more than a joke to people in a positive way, but funny.
Mark, I think we'll end it here. It has been a delight, as it has always been, talking with you once again, this time about We Are Not Alone. Still available from Quirk Books, of course. And I thank you for spending the time with us and allowing us to focus on your book, which has been a bit of a departure from what we might normally consider in the Planetary Society bookstore, but great fun and very, very well done. Thanks.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here, and yeah, I appreciate that you had me on. Always great to talk with you, Matt.
Thank you to all of you who have joined us live, and also to those of you who are watching this, the many more of you who will see the recording of it when it becomes available, or I guess by now it has become available if you're watching after the fact, on our website at planetary.org or the Planetary Society YouTube channel. For those of you watching live, we'll hope to have it up there within a couple of days. It might be Monday, I guess. We love all of you. Thank you for being members and making all of this possible. And I hope that you are prepared, or maybe have already picked up our next book, A City on Mars by Kelly and Zach Weinersmith. It is another really fun book that is getting loads of attention and quite a bit of criticism. I was watching a live stream yesterday that featured Bob Zubrin, founder of the Mars Society, Zubrin the Zealot, as I call him, who actually badmouthed that book, which, and I've heard other people say things about it, which I do not think are at all true. I think it's a great consideration of what we should consider as we talk about not just visiting space, but actually living there and perhaps living on other planets. It is a great read, and I think we're going to have a really good time in the first week of January, because we wanted to get past the holidays, talking to Kelly and Zach. And so more to look forward to, and we will have many, many more great books for you here in the member community, and maybe some other new stuff, some other great conversations that we might be offering you before too long. So thank you to all of you, and we'll quit there. Good evening to all of you for whom it is the evening. Mark, once again, thank you, and best of luck with all of your projects coming up in the future, and with the sales of We Are Not Alone.
Thanks so much, Matt. I appreciate it, and thanks everyone for watching.
You bet. Take care, everyone. Ad Astra.